staying up long past your bedtime, I'm sure. But the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot. It's precisely 11:11 p.m., which is an interesting time. No, good. Thank you very much to all the presenters. I think it's been a fascinating, especially seeing all the papers together really sort of helps me understand what all the different, it really fits very well together. Uh, so I hope you can hear me, Daniel.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. All right. So I'm quickly going to sort of give very succinct points, and let me give a bit of a perspective on myself before I start commenting. In the sense that I sit in the Asian Development Bank in the Philippines, and my precise focus is to try and help governments leverage their funds better for green finance and sustainable climate-based recoveries. So it's heavily focused on innovative finance. That's my focus area for the last several years over here. And so my thought is always about practical issues for the future and how you solve those issues. So I'm going to sort of very quickly skip through all the different papers. Start very much with the first paper, which was very nicely presented by Jan. Thank you very much, Jan, for your paper. And I'm sort of just going to very quickly talk about the points that I think were super interesting and where I think things need to be strengthened according to my perspective. The paper on sovereign debt through the lens of asset management was super interesting for 2 or 3 super useful areas, which is the whole lens of trying to bring a focus on assets and the public sector balance sheet versus the conventional debt to GDP ratio. And I think that's a very important distinction to bring up. The paper brings it up very clearly and tries to shift focus onto assets and how useful that is rather than the prism of simply debt to GDP. I think that's number one. I think that's a very useful thing. I think there's a lot of interest in, I was particularly interested in the whole focus on settling the issue of the Chinese debt in Africa. And I think that was a very, very good effort made in the paper to try and bring a focus on that. I think that was very good. And especially trying to bring the focus on infrastructure as a huge investment. I think that was super interesting. And then I really liked the 4 areas that were spoken about, which were the liquidity support, the patient capital, debt for climate swaps, and asset-based refinance. So, from those perspectives, the paper was very well put together. It enumerated the arguments very well. I guess from a strengthening perspective, when I looked at the title of the paper about asset management or sovereign debt through asset management, what I would have loved to see a lot more, and where there is a huge gap in knowledge in the market, is asset management, is how do you treat the asset? And the paper speaks almost towards the end, almost in passing, about asset recycling and debt swaps, etc. But it's I would have made that a lot more central because eventually the flow of the paper, I think, would have been better served if how the assets are treated, valued, had also been bought in a little bit more. So when I talk about infrastructure, which is my area, there's a big debate about valuation of infrastructure. And I would love to see something more about how do countries value their infrastructure. So it's fine, we're not talking debt to GDP, that's okay. But if you're talking about the assets that have been created, then what are the ways of valuing them, number one? Number two, sustainability. And this is the single biggest issue that I saw in the paper. All the multilaterals, China is in the same vein, have all been financing capital expenditure infrastructure for a number of years, and that's a good thing. But the issue is sustainability of those assets, number one, and number two, the fit. So, given that you're specifically talking about China infrastructure investments, which clearly has, sort of a lot of good connotations, You also need to talk about the process on how that debt has been put into infrastructure. So there, the whole issue is of capacity, the sizing of the projects, because the biggest criticism that the World Bank had back in the 70s was that too much money was being invested in massive projects. So, the biggest example that comes out for China is the Tanzania port project, $10 billion. I mean, I haven't seen port projects of that size in Southeast Asia with much bigger countries and demand potential. So the issue that's going to come up is not simply of financing infrastructure, but financing the right fit of infrastructure with the right projected period, and especially sustainability. There's no point in spending billions in building capital assets which you can't even pay the O&M for. And that's the whole debt trap issue, which needs to be addressed, especially if you're going to bring such a big focus on China. And I'm sort of making the points over here. I think the investment itself is a good thing, but these issues and criticisms will come up. So I think sustainability of infrastructure, the right sizing of the investments made, value for money, the process under which such investments are made, and the single biggest thing which should be there as a metric, which is EIRR, economic rate of return. So if something is being invested for a particular project, does it actually have any benefits, or are we building an airport for 30, 50 years away where there are going to be no revenues? And I think that's the single biggest issue. I think if you're going to talk about examples like Hambantota, I think you need to also, I think it's going to be a challenge to simply say that that the concession was done at the request of the government. I think there's a lot of literature about Hambantota and a lot of criticism. And so the fact that they're delinked, the lending and the concession agreement, that needs to be brought out a little bit more, because that will strengthen your argument actually. And especially that. I think the last thing I think is it would be good to have a little bit more in the way of case studies or examples for some of the issues that you'd put at the end, such as asset recycling. I know that in a situation with a massive amount of debt strain which these countries are facing, and I believe that the projected amount is 77% projected GDP. Asset recycling is the single biggest issue which actually we need to talk about for sustainability of or getting over the crisis. But what is that asset recycling? And I know in my discussions with the finance ministry in Indonesia and in Vietnam, it's not so simple. I mean, is it privatization? Are we trying to do something with capital markets? I think that if you could strengthen that area of asset recycling, I think the paper would be more balanced rather than only focusing, as it looks right now, very heavy on China debt investments in Africa. So, that's my sense. I think it's a super interesting paper. I was very interested to read about your perspectives on the investments of China in Africa. And I think these are some of my suggestions which may help strengthen, but of course for your consideration. I'll stop there on the first paper. Daniel, do you want me to keep going on the other papers?
Yes, keep going and do all four. And then I'll encourage participants to also start putting their comments in the chat box and questions, so we can come to that afterwards. But Anouj, keep going.
All right. Now that I'm in a flow, I'll do that. So the other paper that I was very interested. So I actually read three papers: Jan's paper, Amitabh's paper, and Martin's paper. So I'll just now I'm not an expert on the IMF, and I found the IMF paper fascinating because it focused, especially on not necessarily the liquidity rescues, but their surveillance work, and made recommendations. So I really like the flow of the paper. I really like this focus on what I thought was more of a niche area, and the analysis which had been done to actually show that 5 out of 6 cases there had been warnings which had been put in place, which came good, as it were. I like the fact that there was an enumeration of the fact that the IMF as a neutral agency was willing to be critical, and I actually like that point because in a lot of international financial institutions, the punches are held back a little bit, and I think this was nicely brought out. Now, I guess my one issue that I would have in terms of where that could go a little further is we had discussions with the IMF on innovation and how what they do on evaluation and surveillance could actually go a little further towards helping countries strengthen their management of, in this case, I guess it's debt, but some strategies or some support, and especially some capacity building. And I think when we were working in this area about 5-6 years ago, when I was at the World Bank, there was a lot of discussion on shadow ratings or shadow surveillance aspects, which are only shared with the countries and which could proactively help a country and say, look, you're on a path to basically being marked red. What could be done to improve you? Here are 3 issues, and here are some capacity support, development issues. And they were as simple as financial management systems, which could assess, maybe like Jan's point earlier, the valuation of your assets. Let's make that valued and try to do something with it to monetize assets. But I think that was my one takeaway from the paper as a suggestion. But otherwise, I found the paper super interesting and Martin's presentation was also lovely, actually, and brought that across very well. So nothing further to say there. Now, Barry, if I can quickly shift to Barry, I'm sort of running through the presentation, so I hope you get my my points. Now, Barry's paper I had not read because I thought I was only supposed to read 2 or 3, but I eventually was also looking at the presentation. And I think if the points are the same, then I have these 2 or 3 points on Barry's paper, which is a big good focus on the debt problems which are caused by the pandemic, on revenues, etc. And I really liked your focus on what's being offered and what's needed, and that's beautiful, because that's kind of sort of shows where the gap is. The question I think I had, and I think you brought it out very well, is no thinking of the long term, and that was I think that's exactly right. But the issue is on the recommendation side. Now, because I saw, for example, that you're talking about grants and not a lot is flowing, and I think the implication is that a lot more should flow. And also in terms of your revenue bonds, on the other hand. So there are 2 separate recommendations, if I get it right. One is more grants to flow from multilateral financial institutions, and the other side, you've got these bonds. The bonds idea, really good, because you're trying to link, or you're trying to push the envelope for governments to do not general bonds, where they are raising money and then basically getting a hit on the balance sheets, but project bonds, project recourse bonds, or project revenue payment bonds, if you like. And now that, I think that is very apt. With grants, there's a fundamental issue in terms of how the grants are used. And I fear that could be an area which could get picked up as throwing more wasteful expenditure into governments for things like income transfers and things like that, which load up the balance sheets, but not necessarily productive investments. And I add infrastructure to this, that investments which go into white elephant infrastructure is also going to be a waste of time. So, and this is such an important point, because even today within the ADB, we are talking about how do we better use our grants as impact funds. So not using it for capex, but using it for de-risking, or using it for something similar. And that would be something useful for me to see about how could it's not just the issue of more grants, but the use of better used grants for projects for countries to try and improve their debt sustainability issue. One thing that I felt also, Barry, in the paper and the presentation is, and across I think all the papers, there's a lot of focus on debt management of the governments caused by COVID and so on and so forth. But the issues, the structural issues, have always been there. COVID has just made it a little bit more of a time to actually suggest a green recovery or something like that. But the fundamental issue is that there aren't enough systems which actually measure, the great point Jan had, the valuation of their assets, or I would say monetization of the assets. Why, how do you capture that? And then the whole point of planning of the use of funds so that there is real impact and real sustainability. Now, I think that's just got accentuated with COVID, but the issue of debt management and how funds were being used to invest in projects, I think that's a fundamental issue which perhaps needs a little bit more of a highlight. I'll stop there on Barry's paper, which was again super interesting, and I really like that comparison between the problems and what's needed. And lastly, Amitabh's paper, which obviously sort of is hugely relevant to me because that's exactly what I focus on, the green finance work in across ASEAN. And great structure, I think the great flow. And I think the context is very nicely brought out there. I went through the paper in a lot of detail because I work on this area so much. And I like this, the fact that you went from context to very clear objectives. Your AIR, I think it was. AIR, improve, reduce. And that's important because when we look at, for example, what's being tried in the economic zones, so it's not just about the immediate debt management, but how does a country make revenues? And this is going to be so critical to healthcare, tourism, as you rightly brought out. We're talking about economic hubs for vaccine manufacturing in Vietnam right now. And countries need a push for something positive such as like that. How do we generate revenues? Kazakhstan, we were talking about the logistics hub, as simple as that, as well as this whole issue of using their existing assets, asset recycling, I think was the example you brought, which I think is important to bring out. So I think those were really good points. The flow of the paper is nice. It leads very nicely from objectives into activities. I think where it could be strengthened is in terms of some more of the challenges which are faced with some of the examples you brought out. So for example, bonds, COVID-related bonds, yes, very important, but at the same time, there's a tendency for governments to try and raise money from a COVID-related bond, but not entirely sure of how to measure the framework for making sure it goes into the right type of projects. That's been a massive challenge because everybody talks about green, but everybody doesn't want to use the green frameworks, which, for example, the EU has. That's very important. The capacity of governments, again, when we're talking about sophisticated instruments like asset recycling or debt swaps, I mean, the debt swap example, which was done, for example, in Africa, I think it was done in Africa or South America, that was with the help of USAID, which sat and prepared that one transaction. In Asia, with local governments and with national governments not necessarily having the capacity to leverage, creating the asset recycling models also needs to be improved. So what I would say is in the paper, there needs to be something about the challenge in implementing this, such as capacity building. Doesn't have to be in great detail. And I would also probably put some of the suggestions which you had on those 5 prongs, maybe from simple to complex. And why I mentioned that, different countries, different solutions. So where Thailand and Malaysia are today, some of the solutions would be more apt versus, for example, Cambodia, Laos, right, or Bangladesh. And so different things would need to be suggested there. I think those are my quick takeaways. I apologize for not talking longer because there's been so much rich material from all the speakers, and I hope that's useful, and I'm happy to give more suggestions by mail or something like that. I'll stop over there. Thank you very much. Back to you, Daniel.
Thanks very much, Anouj. I just should add our second commentator today. Unfortunately, there was some confusion on dates and times, and he's actually teaching a class as we speak, and so isn't able to participate. But as said, he will send written comments, so we'll pass those on to people. These have been 4 very rich presentations, and I have lots of thoughts and comments. But before I give comments,